There's a specific window in a narcissist's decline where his behavior gets worse right before it gets better for you, louder, stranger, more erratic than anything you've witnessed from him before. Right at the exact moment his psychology is closest to genuine collapse. If you're watching someone spiral into behavior that feels almost unrecognizable compared to who he was earlier in the relationship, I want to walk you through exactly what you're seeing. Because it looks from the outside like escalating power. It's actually the opposite. It's what collapse looks like from the inside, before it's fully visible even to him. Let's start with a foundational distinction worth understanding before we go through the specific signs, because it changes how you interpret everything that follows. Confident, stable manipulation and desperate, collapsing manipulation look genuinely different once you know what to compare them against. Early in most relationships, and often for a long time afterward, a narcissist's tactics tend to have a certain smoothness to them. Charm deployed with real skill, guilt trips delivered with practiced precision, love bombing that feels almost effortless because it's been refined through years of consistent success. This is what confident manipulation looks like, and it's worth naming clearly because the signs we're about to walk through look nothing like this at all. The behavior we're describing today emerges specifically once that smoothness has broken down. Once the usual tools have been tested repeatedly against genuine resistance and have started visibly to fail. This is worth understanding as a genuinely different psychological state than the confident manipulation that typically characterizes the earlier stages of a relationship. And recognizing the difference is one of the most protective things you can do if you're currently watching someone you know exhibit these specific patterns. The first sign: contradictions within the same conversation. Confident manipulation tends to be internally consistent, at least within a single conversation. A narcissist skilled at managing a specific narrative typically maintains that narrative smoothly, without visible contradiction, because maintaining consistency is part of what makes manipulation effective in the first place. When his confidence is actually collapsing, this consistency starts to break down in real time. You'll notice him arguing something, then contradicting it minutes later within the same exchange, sometimes without seeming to notice the contradiction himself. He might insist he doesn't care what you think, then moments later become visibly agitated by exactly what you think. He might claim total indifference to the relationship ending, then pivot within the same conversation into pleading for it to continue. This isn't calculated inconsistency designed to confuse you. It's a genuine reflection of a psychology no longer capable of maintaining a single, coherent narrative under the pressure it's currently facing. The second sign: escalating volume and intensity that doesn't match the actual stakes of the conversation. Confident manipulation is usually proportionate, at least on the surface, measured enough to seem reasonable, calibrated specifically to avoid appearing as desperate or unhinged as it actually is underneath. When collapse is genuinely underway, this calibration starts failing. You'll notice reactions that are wildly disproportionate to whatever actually triggered them. Genuine rage at a minor, ordinary boundary, intense distress over something that would barely register as significant in a stable psychological state. This disproportion is worth understanding as diagnostic information rather than simply him being difficult. It reflects a system under far more internal pressure than the specific external trigger would normally justify, meaning the intensity you're witnessing is coming from somewhere much larger than the immediate situation actually warrants. The third sign: rapid oscillation between different tactics within a short period. We've discussed throughout this series how a narcissist's psychology tends to move through a sequence of tactics as earlier ones fail: testing, escalation, apparent withdrawal, and so on. Confident manipulation tends to move through this sequence relatively slowly, giving each tactic real time to work before shifting to the next. When collapse is genuinely underway, this sequence compresses dramatically. You might see anger followed within the same day by tearful vulnerability, followed by cold withdrawal, followed by another attempt at charm, all cycling through in a matter of hours or days rather than the weeks or months this sequence typically requires. This rapid cycling reflects a psychology genuinely searching with increasing urgency for anything that might still work rather than confidently executing a strategy it still believes in. The fourth sign, uncharacteristic admissions that seem to slip out rather than being deliberately offered. This is worth listening for specifically because it's genuinely different from the performed vulnerability we've discussed in earlier videos throughout this series. Performed vulnerability tends to be polished, calibrated for effect, clearly aimed at producing a specific response from you. What we're describing here is different, something that sounds almost involuntary, offered without the usual strategic framing, sometimes followed immediately by an attempt to walk it back or minimize it once he seems to register what he's just revealed. This might sound like, "I don't even know why I do this anymore," or "nothing I try is working and I don't understand why," delivered with a rawness that doesn't match his usual, more controlled communication style. The fifth sign, attempts at control that get increasingly specific and increasingly desperate. Confident manipulation tends to work with broad, flexible tactics, general appeals to guilt, general nostalgia, general charm, all of it adaptable depending on how you respond. When collapse is underway, you'll often notice these general tactics narrowing into something much more specific and much more urgent, as though he's running out of broader strategies and starting to grasp at increasingly narrow, increasingly desperate details. This might look like fixating on one particular memory, one specific promise, one narrow argument, returning to it repeatedly across multiple conversations, as though this single detail might finally be the key that unlocks a response nothing else has managed to produce. This narrowing focus is worth understanding as a sign of a search running out of broader options, not as evidence that this particular detail actually carries the significance he's assigning to it. The sixth sign, sudden, uncharacteristic generosity or grand gestures that feel disconnected from anything that's actually happening in the relationship. This is worth distinguishing carefully from ordinary romantic gestures, which have their own context and timing that generally makes sense given what's happening between two people. What we're describing here is different. Gestures that arrive with a kind of urgency and scale that doesn't match the actual state of the relationship, sometimes explicitly designed to demonstrate value or worth in a way that feels less like generosity and more like an attempt to purchase back something that words alone haven't been able to restore. This might look like an expensive, unexpected gift arriving during a period of significant conflict, or a grand public gesture that seems aimed less at genuine connection and more at proving something to you or to an audience that his usual tactics have failed to prove through more ordinary means. The seventh sign, an increasing need to involve third parties in what should be a private conversation. Confident manipulation tends to happen directly, one-on-one, because a narcissist confident in his own tactics doesn't typically need reinforcement from other people to make his case. When collapse is underway, you'll often notice an increasing pattern of pulling other people into the dynamic, asking mutual friends to intervene on his behalf, seeking validation from family members about whether he's really as bad as you're suggesting, sometimes even reaching out to people close to you, hoping their influence might succeed where his own direct efforts have repeatedly failed. This pattern reflects a genuine loss of confidence in his own ability to reach you directly, requiring reinforcement from external sources that his stable, confident self would never have needed to seek out this urgently. The eighth sign, statements that directly, sometimes explicitly, acknowledge that his usual approach isn't working. This is perhaps the most significant sign on this entire list, because it represents something close to conscious awareness breaking through defenses that are usually far more effective at preventing exactly this kind of acknowledgement. You might hear something like, I don't know what else to do, or nothing I say seems to reach you anymore. And statements that, unlike the more calculated appeals we've discussed in earlier videos, actually name the failure directly rather than simply attempting another variation of the same failed strategy. This kind of direct acknowledgement is worth understanding as genuinely significant because it reflects a system that's exhausted its capacity for denial long enough to briefly, involuntarily tell the truth about what's actually happening. Here's what's worth understanding about all 8 of these signs taken together because it explains why they cluster specifically during genuine collapse rather than appearing scattered randomly throughout an entire relationship's history. Each one reflects the same underlying mechanism, a psychological system that's built its entire stability on a continuous, reliable stream of external validation and control. Now facing the genuine, sustained absence of exactly that input without any of its usual tools succeeding in restoring it. The contradictions, the disproportionate intensity, the rapid tactical cycling, the involuntary admissions, the narrowing focus, the desperate gestures, the reaching for third-party reinforcement, and the direct acknowledgement of failure. All of these are simply what a system built on external stability looks like when that stability has genuinely, structurally started to fail, faster than its usual defenses can successfully manage or conceal. Now let's talk about what all of this actually means for you, because understanding these 8 signs clearly is only useful to the extent that it changes how you navigate them, rather than simply giving you a more detailed picture of someone else's internal experience to watch unfold from a safe intellectual distance. Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. Recognizing these signs doesn't mean you should stay to witness the collapse more closely, hoping that continued proximity might finally produce the breakthrough that 8 signs of destabilization seem to be building toward. This is worth naming directly because it's a genuinely common and understandable temptation, especially for an empath who spent significant time hoping for exactly this kind of shift. Evidence that beneath all the harmful behavior, something real is finally cracking open, something that might, if you just stay a little longer, finally produce genuine change. But I want to be honest with you about why this hope, however understandable, deserves real caution. Collapse, even genuine collapse, is not the same thing as accountability, and it's certainly not the same thing as safety. A psychological system in the middle of genuinely losing its usual stability is often, paradoxically, more unpredictable and sometimes more volatile than a system operating with its usual, more practiced confidence. The contradictions and escalating intensity we've described throughout this video don't necessarily resolve into something gentler or more accessible. Sometimes they resolve into behavior that's genuinely more erratic, more difficult to predict, and in some cases more concerning from a safety perspective than the more controlled manipulation that characterized earlier stages. This is worth stating clearly. If you're witnessing these signs and the behavior accompanying them feels increasingly volatile or unsafe, that observation deserves to be taken seriously and acted on directly, not filtered through a hopeful lens of, this means he's finally breaking through to something real. Here's the second thing worth understanding, and it matters enormously for protecting your own peace regardless of which direction this collapse eventually resolves in. Your role in this process was never actually to stay present for it, guide it toward a positive outcome, or provide the stability that might help him navigate it more gracefully. This is worth stating directly, because these 8 signs can trigger exactly the caretaking instinct we've discussed throughout this entire series. The deep, genuine compassion that makes you want to help someone who's visibly struggling, even someone who's caused you real harm. That compassion is not wrong to feel. But acting on it by staying present, by offering yourself as the stabilizing force this collapsing system is searching for, doesn't actually serve his genuine healing, and it definitely doesn't serve yours. Remember something we've discussed at length throughout this series. Genuine change requires internal generation, not external rescue. If this collapse eventually produces something real, genuine accountability, sustained self-examination, the kind of rare transformation we've discussed is possible but uncommon, it will happen because he does the difficult internal work required to build a new foundation, not because you stayed present to catch him during the fall. Your continued presence during this specific phase doesn't actually accelerate genuine healing. It simply provides exactly the external stabilization his psychology is currently searching for, which delays whatever internal reckoning might eventually need to happen without your involvement at all. Here's what I want you to understand as the actual, practical takeaway from everything we've discussed today. If you recognize these 8 signs in someone you're currently navigating a relationship with, or someone you're in the process of separating from, understand them as information rather than as an invitation. They tell you something true and useful, that his confidence is genuinely structurally destabilizing, that the usual tools are genuinely failing him, that whatever certainty and control he once projected is genuinely no longer intact. This information is worth having because it helps you understand what you're actually witnessing rather than being confused or destabilized by behavior that might otherwise seem inexplicable. But this information doesn't obligate you to stay, to help, to guide, or to witness whatever comes next. Your own safety, your own peace, and your own continued healing remain exactly as important during this specific phase as they were during every earlier phase of this relationship, regardless of how much more visibly destabilized he appears to be. If anything, this phase deserves even more caution than earlier ones, precisely because the unpredictability we've described throughout this video makes his behavior genuinely harder to anticipate than it was when his usual more practiced tactics were still holding. If you're currently watching someone exhibit these exact 8 signs, I want you to trust what you're seeing without needing to stay close enough to watch it resolve. His confidence collapsing is real, and it's happening, whether or not you remain present to witness every stage of it. What happens next, on his side of this collapse, was never actually something you needed to be there for in order for your own healing, your own boundaries, and your own life to continue moving forward exactly as they should.